Reentry and Community Corrections is the title of this session. We have as our panelist Ed Rhine, who earned his PhD in Sociology at Rutgers. He is the Deputy Director of the Office of Policy and Offender Reentry with the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections. We have Alicia Handwerk, who earned her Juris Doctorate at the Ohio State University. She is currently the Chief of the Bureau of Community Sanctions with the Ohio Department of Corrections, Rehabilitation and Corrections. And then we have Paula Smith, who is an Assistant Professor in the Department of Criminal Justice at the University of Cincinnati, and she earned her PhD in Criminal Justice at the University of New Brunswick. Welcome to our panelists and speakers, and hope you enjoy the morning.
Well, we can keep this very informal and I think very interactive as we go. I'm actually not going to be speaking today, but I want to highlight the topics that we're going to be speaking about because they are interconnected. And it is awfully important as we move forward in field corrections and as we move the reentry agenda forward that we do so by drawing on the literature and evidence and research. And the topics that we've selected today for presentation are a very clear indication of how far I think the field has come in terms of incorporating research into practice and the importance of doing so. And the fortunate thing is that we're going to start with Alicia Handwerk, and I think many of you, though not all of you, know Alicia. She's also a lawyer by training. She was just shared, the Chief of the Bureau of Community Sanctions. But she has over 15 years of experience with the Department of Rehabilitation and Correction. And she was involved a number of years ago, not that long ago, with a major study in Ohio of CBCFs, community-based correctional facilities and halfway houses. And that study was done by the University of Cincinnati and directed by Ed Latessa. Ed is a well-known presence in Ohio, nationwide, and even internationally. And in essence, what that study showed was that when you incorporate the principles that drive effective correctional programming, you do, in fact, produce results that contribute to reduced offender recidivism in the community. And the department with UC has once again launched a second such study, continuing to work with CBCFs and halfway houses, and just as importantly, in terms of research and practice, bringing into existence accountability for the results produced. And halfway houses and CBCFs increasingly are being held accountable themselves to incorporate this research into their culture, into their practice, into their staff training, and ultimately into the outcomes that they achieve year in, year out. We offer a subsidy to those operations. And ultimately, the sanction is the subsidy gets pulled back. The flip side of that is, and more importantly, the incentive is, we hope, as we go forward, to be able to acknowledge and support with additional subsidies those programs that have demonstrated their efficacy in relation to reducing offender recidivism. And so that's very, very important. In addition, that kind of project speaks to the critical need for accurate assessment, the accurate and reliable and valid assessment of risk and needs offenders present, and translating that risk and needs assessment into meaningful case planning, program intervention, and transitional support services, especially as offenders leave institutions and return to the community. And we are involved with the University of Cincinnati and with Dr. Smith and with Ed Latessa on a major project called the Ohio Risk Assessment System. And Dr. Smith is going to talk about that. The beauty of having Paula here is the fact that she works and is a dear colleague of Paul Gendreau and many of the Canadians who themselves were really the catalysts that for the last 20 to 25 years debunked heartily in research the notion that nothing works. And the fact of the matter is, systems today in corrections, institutional and community, policymakers have an affirmative obligation, in my estimation, to grab onto that research and figure out how to translate it into meaningful direction and meaningful practice, and to use to change the culture of how we do business. And the Ohio Risk Assessment System is going to be a comprehensive approach. It will represent a tool or a series of decision-making tools that we will use at different decision-making points across the criminal justice system in Ohio. And once we launch it, we will have it forever. It will represent the collection of a dynamic database that we'll be able to use and tap and make more precise, more valid, and more useful in terms of its utility across the system. And our long-term goal is to have every court, every probation office, every APA office, and the whole of our institutional operations alongside CPCS using the same risk and needs instruments, using the same tools, using the same shared vocabulary, and understanding what all of this means when we talk about a moderate to high risk offender, or just as importantly, a low risk offender. And so you're going to hear about these projects today. And I think, in fact, we only have an hour, a little less now. I suspect you guys will talk quickly, but let's make it interactive. We have the advantage here that we have a small group, and as questions occur to you, feel free to ask questions of the presenters. And at this point, I'll ask Alicia to come forward.
Good morning. I hope this doesn't mean that. Oh, good.
Does that help? Yeah, good, buddy.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I titled this From Research to Action Part 2 for a couple of reasons. And the first one is shortly after we completed our initial study, I was invited to a conference that basically talked about this huge research project we had done and where we were going with it. And I said at the time, it didn't do us any good to do all of this research if we didn't put some action to it. So the title of my initial presentation was From Research to Action. Let me tell you a little bit about the Bureau of Community Sanctions before we get started. We have a budget of approximately $125 million, and that money goes for a lot of different things, including Community Corrections Act, jail and prison diversion programs. Those are programs that keep people out under probation type programs, electronic monitoring, day reporting, that sort of thing. Community-based correctional facilities, which somewhere between a jail and a halfway house, a kind of a secure, very secure programming unit. Halfway houses, I think most people are kind of familiar with that. We also do electronic monitoring and GPS of those offenders who have been let out of our department that are not behaving very well, or who we feel may be somewhat threatening to the public, so we put them on GPS so that we can monitor them a little more closely. Independent housing is for those offenders who really don't need much more than a roof over their heads and a place to cook and an address while they're job hunting and trying to get their lives back on track. Permanent supportive housing is the opposite end of the spectrum. It's folks that cannot live out in the community at the time of release because their condition